I think it's sort of normalized, John. These three guys who are on opposite sides of some of the most heated philosophical, political debates in the United States, on the red team or the blue team, they're working for the same guy in Romania because they're willing to set aside their qualms and their differences to pursue these big paydays from the green team. And here I'm rubbing my fingers together, the universal gesture for money.
This is CBS Eye on the World. I'm John Batchelor. It is spring 2018, Washington, D.C., the Hay Adams Hotel, a posh setting, and the rooftop gives you a view of the White House and the grounds around the White House, the Treasury Building, the Executive Office Building, the corridors of power. An event that evening, hosted by a lobbyist, a man with some reputation, who is seeking to please the representatives of the Democratic Republic of Congo at that moment facing an election. The longtime President Kabila is asked to step aside for democracy. He may not want to. And this event is to demonstrate to the DRC that they have chosen the right man, Robert Strick, the lobbyist who can deliver for them a relationship with the State Department that permits them to maintain power while not maintaining Mr. Kabila in the presidency. There's much more to say, but I welcome the author of this scene and a new book, Devil's Advocates, The Hidden Story of Rudy Giuliani, Hunter Biden, and the Washington insiders on the payroll of corrupt foreign interests, Kenneth P. Vogel, Ken Vogel of the New York Times, who's watched this story of lobbying for many years, and we give him back his life now to talk about his book. Congratulations, Ken. A very good evening to you. Robert Strick, as hosting a party that may or may not be pleasing to him because some important people to whom he invited did not show up, including John Bolton, the national security advisor at the time, members of the State Department. They're not there. But suddenly, a man everybody knows walks in with a date. His name is Rudy Giuliani, the former mayor of New York, known as America's mayor. Who is Robert Strick, and why is Rudy Giuliani there? And what does it mean to be on the roof of the Hay Adams when you're taking money from the Democratic Republic of Congo? Good evening to you, Ken.
Hey, thank you, John. Thank you for having me. And yeah, this was quite a scene that I heard about a couple weeks later and was able to reconstruct for my book. Um, it's not uncommon in Washington lobbying, foreign lobbying in particular, for lobbyists to try to create events that give the veneer of sort of acceptability for clients, sometimes unsavory foreign clients to Washington to show that like these guys, you may have heard that they are, part of a brutal, oppressive regime, which was the case with Joseph Kabila, the president of Congo, who the United States government had wanted to step down and who had exceeded his term, the constitutional term limits of the Democratic Republic of Congo for many years. And so this guy, Kabila, and the people around him were looking to essentially start anew with the Trump administration and see if they could find some wiggle room that would allow Kabila, either Kabila himself to stay in power or just the people around Kabila to stay in power. So they threw a bunch of money around starting very early in Trump's first term, even before Trump was sworn in. They hired a bunch of lobbyists, including Bob Dole, the former senator and Republican presidential nominee, and others who were unable to get them the type of access and the sort of like this like I said, this veneer of like acceptability in Washington. And so instead, they hired this guy, Robert Strick, who was a relative newcomer to the sort of high level foreign lobbying scene, but had managed to like burst into the scene because Trump, when Trump came into office the first time, didn't have a lot of people around him who were the traditional power brokers and gatekeepers that make up Washington's professional political class that stays in power, or that at least stays prominent regardless of who is the president or who controls Congress. And Strick had sort of burst into this vacuum that was created when Trump came into office and marketed himself, quite successfully to foreign governments and foreign regimes and foreign businesses as one of the few guys who could get the attention of this small circle of folks around Trump who were setting policy. And as you mentioned, he throws this party to try to demonstrate that he can bring these types of folks being Trump insiders to the Congolese, but invited a lot of high profile people who were the actual official parts of the Trump administration, including John Bolton, Ryan Zinke, who was the Interior Secretary. And if those folks had come, it would have sent a signal that, hey, the Congolese, they may have had terrible relationships with Washington under administrations past, but we're turning over a new leaf under Trump's administration, turning the page, and we have the potential to have good relationships. So their absence was quite notable. But when Rudy Giuliani showed up, it sort of signaled something different. Rudy Giuliani, we should say, like not just the former mayor of New York, but a longtime friend and associate of Donald Trump, and was at this point serving as Donald Trump's personal attorney, dealing with all manner of the investigations that had dogged Trump in his early days in office. And so Rudy Giuliani was seen correctly as a guy who had the ear of the president. So delivering Rudy Giuliani to this event was a feather in Robert Strick's cap and was something that the Congolese and their handlers saw as a potential crack in the door that could lead to a new relationship with the Trump administration. That was what they wanted when they threw around a bunch of money to try to bring in lobbyists who promised this. And so Robert Strick was able to deliver something of value to the Congolese, even if it was something that was not out of the traditional lobbying or foreign policy playbook. You typically would not go to the president's personal attorney who has no government role to try to, kindle a relationship that would lead to foreign policy outcomes. You would go through the traditional channels, the official channels of the foreign policy apparatus. Well, in Trump's Washington, things were very different, particularly that Trump's first term. And Robert Strick was one of the folks who took advantage of the sort of informal channels for diplomacy, the private diplomacy that was emerging around President Trump during that period.
At this time, Robert Strick is 41 years old. He's a kid from Arizona, a college dropout, high school dropout, a man who has been on the bad side of check writing for quite some time. He has a reputation across America as not paying his bills and being belligerent when challenged. He's also a man who has to depend upon his parents now and again for sleeping on their couch when things don't work out for him. He is an anti-hero of the scale of Barry Lyndon. You can't take your eyes off of him, even though you can disapprove of every decision he makes, which is self-interested and probably false. However, he is representing of tying together some major figures in the Trump administration, in the Biden administration, and Ken has chosen well. A detail about Robert Strick. At this point, he's the head of the Sonoran Policy Group, which I believe is something, or has been, part of his reputation back in Arizona. Is he considered in his work in the Arizona state? He ran for assemblyman. I think he was thinking about running for mayor of a town. He dealt with major officials in Arizona. Is he welcome in Arizona, or did he leave town just in time?
No, he had burned bridges pretty much everywhere that he had gone, including in Arizona, where he started out and set his sights on becoming a lobbyist. I mean, this is something that was like long a goal of his, and that he had tried various ways at various times with various sort of patrons, these powerful people who do have the connections to the government, to break into this field. And each time he had tried to do so, it had ended sort of disastrously. So in Arizona, excuse me, he had cultivated a guy who was a powerful state lawmaker and actually gone into business with him, ended with lawsuits in which emails were produced at Discovery that showed these powerful Arizonan political figures saying that, well, Strick is he's a loose cannon and he can be a problem, but he's got the gift of gab. He's like a charming guy. He's a good talker. And this is something that allowed him to continue to find new opportunities, even as they ended badly. So this was not, this stint in Washington at the Hay Adams that we're talking about. This was not his first attempt to even break into Washington high-level lobbying. He had had a small lobbying firm, actually under the same name, Sonora and Policy Group, in the second Bush administration. But when, and he had had a number of clients that were in this sort of defense procurement place. He's representing small defense contractors that want to become big defense contractors by getting big contracts from the Pentagon. And he's helped them a little bit, but he's you still see it at that point as like a big talker who doesn't necessarily deliver the results. And when Obama wins in 2008, Strick's business collapse. He moves west. He tries to break in California politics. That's where he tried to run for mayor in the sort of California wine country unsuccessfully. He ends up opening, or rather buying, a winery in Oregon. He sees himself as like a potential player in the wine field. That doesn't go well. A bunch of lawsuits there from some of the growers and the former his former business partners at the winery. And it's at that point that Trump is bursting onto the political scene, declaring his presidential campaign in 2015 with that famous ride down the golden elevator at Trump Tower in Manhattan. And Trump, like I say, it's not just that he doesn't have connections to the professional gatekeepers in Washington. At that point, he didn't have any connections to the Republican consulting class, and a lot of the people in that space who would traditionally be counted on to raise money for and run a campaign were turning up their noses at him, creating an opportunity for folks like Strick to
Right.
assist the campaign. He assisted the campaign, in an informal way. And when Donald Trump surprised everyone and won, beating Hillary Clinton, it created an opportunity for Strick to try his hand again at breaking into big time.
Let's go to the New Zealand story, Ken, because it's an evidence of serendipity here. The story of devil's advocates include a man named Robert Strick, who's at the center of this, a young man, very attractive, a good talker, a good salesman, and the term is old-fashioned grifter. That's a 19th century word. Here it is. However, serendipity is also part of grifting. One day, in discouragement, he's sitting at a roadside cafe. I imagine it's in Georgetown, a leafy setting, and a large dog wanders up and either befriends him or regards him as a possible subject of attention. The dog is trailed by a young woman who turns out to be a representative of New Zealand. Ken, it doesn't get any more accidental than this. What does Robert Strike make of this moment in time?
Well, like with all the sort of moments that he seizes in his sort of peripatetic journey, he initially is just sort of drawn to the conversation and wants to show off without regard for whether there is a potential benefit for him, a business or pecuniary benefit for him. And so he starts talking to the owner of the dog, who is, as you said, she's the second in command at the New Zealand embassy in Washington, D.C. And they have some small talk about wine and New Zealand wine, and Strick talks about his Oregon winery. And before long, the conversation turns to the subject that was dominating everyone's attention back then. And, now fast forward 10 years, and it's still dominating everyone's attention, which is Donald Trump. But at that time, Trump was, he wasn't yet even sworn in. It was in the transition period soon after he upset Hillary Clinton and won. And this New Zealand diplomat tells him, with a degree of candor that I think is refreshing and surprising in diplomatic circles, but something that is sort of an unspoken truth of everyone in that community, which was that the New Zealanders, the Kiwis, were completely unprepared for Trump. They were preparing for a Hillary Clinton presidency. And so, as a result of that lack of preparation, they didn't have any connections to the incoming Trump team. And that put them in a terrible situation, which the New Zealand DCM, a woman by the name of Carolyn Beresford, shares with Strick and says, we haven't even been able to arrange a congratulatory phone call between our head of state, the Prime Minister of New Zealand, and the President-elect Donald Trump, which is just a customary thing that typically happens with all allies. And New Zealand, should point out, is a major ally, Five Eyes country, that has a long tradition of close relationships with the United States. So this is like a potentially serious issue that this New Zealand diplomat lays out for Strick, and Strick just blurts out, because he has these ties to the sort of periphery of Trump world. He says, "What if I could get you the phone number of the president-elect Donald
I
Trump?"
love this scene, Ken. This is wonderful. You had me. I mean, it was as if you were writing theater piece. Cut to the embassy. He's
Yeah,
standing
so
there. He's got a phone number, and he
yeah,
gives it.
so
He gives it to the ambassador. What happens next?
Yeah, the ambassador they punch in the number. It's in the Chancery, which is the residence of the New Zealand ambassador to Washington, right next to the embassy, and they punch in the number, and sure enough, it's picked up not by Trump, but by a handler for Trump, and they say, "Can we connect the president elect to the New Zealand?" They identify themselves, the New Zealand ambassador. Can we connect the president to the Prime Minister of New Zealand? And they say sure, and they get Trump on the line, but the call doesn't actually go through to the Prime Minister. There had been an earthquake in New Zealand, a terrible earthquake that the Prime Minister was responding to, but they get the connection. They set another time for the call. The call goes through, and the New Zealanders are quite surprised and pleased that they feel like they found a shortcut.
And no one is more surprised than Strick, who had no idea whether it would work. He was winging it the whole time. The
That's
gods
correct.
blessed him at that moment, Ken. That's extremely impressive. Given his level of deception, he accidentally told the truth. That number worked.
Well,
So,
it was a bluff, sure, but he did have a connection that he used to
sure.
get that number. Stuart Jolly is a guy who had been the national field director for the Trump campaign, and Strick had sort of served as an informal advisor for Stuart Jolly, and at one point the campaign manager, Corey Lewandowski. And so he had these connections, and in a traditional administration or transition, because Trump was not yet president, like there would be so many layers of bureaucracy and gatekeepers that would, and the president wouldn't have a personal cell phone that.
Ken, we need to get back to Rudy Giuliani. We'll leave Robert Strick there with his success. The book is Devil's Advocates, The Hidden Story of Rudy Giuliani, Hunter Biden, and the Washington Insiders of the Payrolls of Corrupt Foreign Interests, including Robert Strick, my version of Barry Lyndon. You can't take your eyes off of him, but momentarily we must, because there's another fascinating Barry Lyndon-like character in this story in a parallel universe. His name is Hunter Biden. And just as Robert Strick is getting some credibility with the accident of New Zealand, and it will take him to other countries that want favors or want to meet the Trump administration, Hunter Biden has a problem. He's been spending lavishly on the basis of many of his connections, one most in particular, Ukraine, and the board of an energy company where he is paid $1 million a year until he learns that because his father is no longer vice president, but former vice president, his salary or his stipend will be cut in half from 1 million to 500,000. And for reasons to do with Hunter Biden's universe, 500,000 is not enough to feed all of the demands that he's making on his body and his family. He's got a problem. And the problem will get worse and worse as we go forward, as he's more and more desperate for money. And can you make the argument that this happens routinely when administrations change? And one way to react is to cut down on your lifestyle. The other way is to take risks. What kind of risks does Mr. Biden take? And how does it lead him to Rudy Giuliani? Thank you.
Well, yeah, I mean, Hunter Biden had a number of problems that were sort of compounding. You mentioned the sort of personal difficulties in the lavish lifestyle, which were fueled by an addiction problem to both drugs and alcohol, that fueled personal problems, the sort of disintegration of his marriage. This all comes as his brother is gravely ill with brain cancer and ultimately dies in 2015, sending him deeper into the spiral of addiction, which then sends him deeper into the sort of money problems and the family problems. And so he had been able to sort of alleviate the financial problems because when his father was vice president, he was a hot commodity in this foreign influence space. He had signed a number of clients and business partners around the world who had interests that overlap with those of his father's administration, not just the Obama administration, but even particularly, even more acutely, the Joe Biden's sort of portfolio within the Obama administration, where Joe Biden was tasked with overseeing policy in Ukraine and other parts of the world where there were allies who were seen as having corruption problems that Joe Biden was urging them to clean up. And it's not a coincidence that in a few of those places, the some of the top targets of those anti-corruption prosecutions that were being supported by the U.S. government and by Vice President Biden signed Hunter Biden, the vice president's son, as a either a representative or a business partner. And in those cases, they thought that, because this is the way that politics works in other parts of the world, that the way to solve a problem with the government is to throw money at people around the top officials in the government. And that was a dynamic that Hunter Biden recognized was like quite lucrative for him. And as you alluded to, that dynamic dried up, or the tap, sort of the faucet was turned down at least a little bit when his father left the vice presidency. And so he continued in this space and continued to look for opportunities, but that required him to be a little more aggressive and take on more risk. And so one of the stories that I get into in the book has to do with a Romanian real estate magnate who was the subject of an anti-corruption prosecution. Hunter Biden started working with this guy when Joe Biden was the vice president, and when Joe Biden left the vice presidency, this guy started looking for people who were close to Trump. But what Hunter Biden did to show his value is at the same time he was working with a Chinese state linked fund, and he tried to bring in the Chinese to invest in some of the property that the Romanian real estate magnate owned. That was the subject of a prosecution over a corrupt land deal in Romania. And this actually led to a scenario, and this land, I should say, was became a major development in Romania and Bucharest and north of the sort of city center that included a very high-end mall, like a retail mall, as well as office space and residences. And one of the tenants of this real estate magnate in this district in North Bucharest was none other than the U.S. government. And the U.S. government actually rented the space on which it built the embassy in Romania from this real estate magnate. So Hunter Biden's solution, or his team's solution, was, okay, the Romanians are coming after this guy, our client, because of this land deal. What if we sold the land, or at least a portion of the land that was the subject of this prosecution, to the Chinese, so that he wouldn't even own the land anymore, wouldn't own the majority of the land that was the subject of this case, and maybe the Romanian prosecutors would back away from the prosecution as a result. It would have resulted in a scenario where the Chinese government owned either the land on which the U.S. embassy in Romania sat, or at least the land around it, which, as you could imagine, as your listeners could imagine, would create quite a national security, or at least operational security threat, to have an adverse government own land on which the U.S. embassy sat. This was an example of the risk and the sort of the way the way that Hunter Biden's pursuit of these foreign paydays led him to places that were anathema to U.S. foreign policy interests, but continued to keep the money flowing to him. That, I should say, that land deal did not actually end up going through.
I know, but you can't make this stuff up, Ken. The Chinese government turns out to be state security and an influence operation. The Romanian is headed to jail. The Biden family turns to a man who used to be the director of the FBI named Louis Freeh. Freeh needs help, so he calls on his old protege, a boss, Rudy Giuliani. That's how we get Giuliani in the story. Ken, if this wasn't so carefully documented with your excellent reporting, it's unbelievable. It's at some point, did they get in the back of their limos and think, "What am I doing?" Does anybody talk like that afterwards, Ken?
I think it's sort of normalized, John, and you see that that just that cast of characters that you just tick through there. That you have Hunter Biden working for this corrupt Romanian oligarch with Louis Freeh, the former head of the FBI, who had, Hunter Biden obviously a Democrat, Louis Freeh is a Republican, but he plays both sides. He was the FBI director under Bill Clinton, as well as under George W. Bush, and then bringing in Rudy Giuliani, who of course is a Republican. And so, like, these three guys who are on opposite sides of some of the most heated philosophical, political debates in the United States, on the red team or the blue team, they're working for the same guy in Romania because they're willing to set aside their qualms and their differences to pursue these big paydays from the green team. And here I'm rubbing my fingers together, the universal gesture for money. But I think that normalization of it, of this industry, and the expectation that like well-connected Americans can avail themselves of these quite lucrative foreign paydays because these foreign interests want to navigate Washington, want to either get be in the good graces of Washington or at least stay out of the crosshairs of Washington. This is just an accepted part of like the Washington professional political community, such that I think that they recognize that there is a reputational cost to it, but they kind of see it in some ways as like their not their birthright, but like they're owed this. Like they have this juice in Washington, and how they choose to exercise it to make a living is, from their perspective, just normal.
They call on Rudy Giuliani, who's connected with Mr. Trump for a long time. They were together when Rudy Giuliani was mayor of New York and the 9/11 events, and Donald Trump is a prominent figure in New York for many years. So Louis Freeh calls Rudy Giuliani, and suddenly the problem seems either solved or on its way to being solved. Romania is satisfied. China is satisfied. Nobody actually changes money except for Hunter gets a lot of opportunities and promises from China. At what point, Ken, did the Bidens recognize that the man they were dealing with was Chinese state security? Did they ever talk about it?
Well, we know now because of the leak of files from Hunter Biden's laptop, famously received by Rudy Giuliani under sort of questionable circumstances right before the 2020 election. But it contained a lot of correspondence between Hunter Biden and his business partners, and we do see Hunter Biden expressing it's concern is maybe the wrong word, but sort of like wonderment at like the circles in which he found himself traveling with these Chinese, well-connected Chinese folks. And at one point, he refers to one of the people who is, I think, his client as the spy chief of China. So there is some recognition there. But the people around Hunter, some of whom I've talked to, and one of whom I quote in the book, they dismissed the idea that they were the targets, that they, Hunter mostly, and the Biden family, but also their associates, were the targets of a Chinese influence campaign. And they say, well, it couldn't have been that because this deal that you're talking about with the Chinese and the embassy, this started to take shape in early 2017. So Joe Biden was no longer the vice president. But of course, it wouldn't take a genius or like a sophisticated political analyst to look at the landscape and know that Joe Biden was already at that point a prospective presidential candidate. And also, even if he never decided to run for president again in 2020, which of course we know he did and was successful, he was still a very influential American who had a lot of ties in Washington. So it does stand to reason that the Chinese, if they are pursuing an influence operation that would give them connections around the world, would target the Bidens for something like that. And, again, Hunter is aware that the reason why these people are coming to him is because of his last name and his connection to not just his father, but to the Democratic Party establishment. And I think it's sort of disingenuous to, for the Biden defenders, as they once did, to suggest that this had nothing to, none of this foreign business had anything to do with Joe Biden. Clearly it did. And clearly Hunter Biden was willing to take advantage of the perception that paying him meant getting access with his father.
The quote that you're referring to in your book, this is Hunter Biden. I have another New York Times reporter calling my representation of the, pause, literally, Dr. Patrick Ho, the vulgarity spy chief of China, who started the company that my partner, who is worth 323 billion, founded and is now missing. Wow, Ken, was that you or was that a colleague of yours? This
No, that
call.
was that was not me. No, that was a
Yeah.
colleague. And I should say, like, when we talk about a lot of this stuff, and I think there's a common criticism, which I'm not dismissing, but of books like this that come out after the fact that cover relatively recent political developments. Well, why didn't this come out in real time? And here you see an example where my colleagues were, in fact, trying to unpack this story in real time and did write a story. I mean, it wasn't the full story because we didn't have the benefit of all the information that came out from the laptop and from Freedom of Information Act requests that I filed with the government that take a long time to be fulfilled. But my short answer to that criticism is, yeah, I wish more of this stuff. I wish more of everything came out in real time, but that's not the world that we live in. So I was able to tell this story with the benefit of these documents that came out later, and also with the benefit of being able to talk to people who might have not been inclined to discuss this with me when it was an ongoing concern and are only feel more comfortable doing so after the fact.
Yes, Ken, but you knew someday it would highly entertain me. That's why it was worth putting in your book. We need to turn to what it is they're tiptoeing around. Why is there hesitation about selling your services and pitching the president or his offices? Why is why is everybody filing all the time and pointing fingers and avoiding things? Why do people like Paul Manafort go to jail? There's something called FARA. You'll hear it now and again talked on the radio. Ken, what is FARA? What is it meant to do? How is it regarded?
Yeah, as far as the Foreign Agents Registration Act, and this is the primary vehicle that the U.S. government has for creating accountability and transparency around foreign influence. That is the paid foreign lobbying and public relations campaigns that politically connected foreigners launch to try to influence the U.S. government, U.S. politics, U.S. media. The FARA came about because there was concern that this type of activity was going on without any visibility, particularly in the run up to World War II with the Third Reich and the Nazis paying Americans, well-connected American public relations consultants, to essentially whitewash the image of Hitler and the Third Reich. As World War II was unfolding in Europe, but the U.S. was not yet involved, and the goal of the Third Reich was to essentially keep the U.S. out of the war by suggesting that Hitler was not as bad as the characterizations of him in the media or critics, who were trying to raise alarms about Hitler's activities in Europe. And so, there were a number of American public relations consultants that were paid a great deal of money to put out these campaigns that at one point, tried to lure Americans to Germany for the purposes of tourism, but then later sort of focused on German industry and how
We
German
have a minute,
industry.
Ken. What is the law for them at the time? Because it's changing.
Yeah, that's right. So there is no law, and they have no requirement to disclose this, and that became a scandal when Congress figured out that this was going on, and Congress, rightfully identified a public interest in having some transparency around who was funding and facilitating these messages. They believed that there was a risk that the U.S. public would be sort of like desensitized to
Right.
to Hitler's activities, and so there was an interest in creating a law that would require the people who were being paid by these foreign principals. That's the term that they use, foreign principals, uh, to essentially, do public relations or do lobbying of the U.S. government. And the result was this Foreign Agents Registration Act, which is largely a transparency law. I mean, there are criminal repercussions and there's criminal penalties associated with it, but the penalties are, if you don't register this activity, that's not prohibiting activity. It's saying you can work for whoever you want as long as you
Let's go.
disclose.
Let's go traveling, Ken, because this is fun. We're going to dangerous parts of the world with Ken Vogel in his new book, Devil's Advocates. Now, what we have here is a story that is unbelievable, except for Ken has backed it up with interviews and footnotes and cross examinations over many years. This is not just now. This dates back well into the 20th century and perhaps before it. However, the revelations involve an enormous amount of money transferred between especially states with the worst human relations possible, violent people, to the interlocutors who prosper in Washington on those avenues with fancy offices that some of which overlook the White House, some of which overlook the Capitol. The man who invented the modern style is with us. His name is Paul Manafort. He served some time for violation of the FARA laws that insist that you register that you're working for devils, advocates, and that you maintain careful records. Well, Paul Manafort was found not telling everything, not being transparent, while he was a member of the Trump circle. However, Robert Strick, who is a character in this book that is undeniably fascinating, though he's also outrageous. You can't take your eyes off of him. He's an anti-hero. And Rudy Giuliani and all the other characters around Mr. Trump's campaign you hear from now, and the people who were prominent in the Biden administration, all are part of the story. So we begin with Paul Manafort and what we can learn from his conduct. Ken, congratulations again. The firm at hand is Manafort, Stone, Black, and Kelly. What was it once upon a time? What did it represent? What did it invent?
Well, yeah, John, as you point out, that Manafort had a role in. I mean, he was arguably the godfather of this industry. And by the way, I should say it's not just the foreign influence industry. He really helped shape the lobbying, the domestic lobbying industry. And the way that he did this was he and his partners, whose names are in the name of the firm, they started out as political consultants, helping the campaigns of a number of members of Congress and presidential candidates, literally helping to elect presidents, including Reagan and Bush. Bush won. And what they realized was like after you elect the president, suddenly you are in high demand, or the president or members of Congress, you are in high demand from private sector interests to who are seeking to influence the president or the members of Congress who you helped elect. And so in Washington before Manafort, those were like two separate lanes. You had one team who would you pay to help elect you, and then there was another group of people who these private sector interests would pay to influence the people who just got elected. What Manafort, Stone, Black, and Kelly did was they brought that together under one roof and said, we will help elect these people, and then we will turn around and lobby them on behalf of well-paying clients, in some cases domestic clients. And what Manafort did is first he created that industry, and then he decided to export that industry internationally. So he was not only helping to elect the Americans, the American public officials, he was helping to elect the foreign public officials by running the campaigns in their countries. And then he would turn around and tell the foreign officials, now you can pay me and I will influence the American president, who I also helped elect, and began sort of serving as an unofficial back channel between the Reagan and Bush 1 administrations and some of these quite unsavory, repressive regimes around the world who the U.S. had an interest in sort of either keeping in check or keeping at least a line of communication open with. And, for a long time, Manafort made a lot of money doing this and disclosed at least some of it under FARA. There became a point, however, where And it wasn't just Manafort, where a lot of the people who were sort of Manafort copycats doing this same stuff basically started treating Farah as more optional and stopped registering as rigorously their foreign activity under the act with the Justice Department. And this was, as you point out, what brought him into the crosshairs of the Justice Department when he reemerged. Because he sort of disappeared from U.S. politics, Manafort did, because the foreign work was so lucrative. And it was only after 2014 when one of his top paying clients, this strongman Ukrainian president who was aligned with Moscow named Viktor Yanukovych, he was overthrown by street protesters who were appalled by his corruption and kleptocracy and also his pivot towards Moscow and towards Vladimir Putin. And when he left, Yanukovych ended up fleeing to Moscow, but not coincidentally. Manafort's gravy train also ended, and Manafort needed to sort of reemerge and sort of resuscitate his U.S. I guess that's the wrong word, refurbish his
Right.
U.S. sort of political reputation. So he signs up with the Trump campaign in 2015, 2016, and ends up being sort of thrust into the spotlight again in a way that was unfortunate for him, coincided with the Justice Department's interest, sort of rekindled foreign interest in foreign influence because the Trump campaign was seen as a having back channel relations with Putin. And so Manafort ends up becoming the top target of the Mueller investigation, which had as one of its sort of key uh, arrows in the quiver the prosecution of people for violating the Foreign Agents Registration Act. Manafort ultimately was convicted by a jury and then pleaded guilty to other charges, went to jail, and was freed only at the end of the first Trump administration by a pardon from Donald Trump.
One of his proteges is Robert Strick, and we'll come into Robert Strick and the travels, the adventures of our Barry Lyndon figure. But another one of his proteges, I believe, is Tony Podesta, who's in the same business for the other team, but also is worried about Farah and gives up his firm for a while, I believe, and while his brother is in the administration, the Obama administration, I believe, and had a role in the Biden administration. So this is a skill that Manafort inspires people to copy.
Yeah, and Manafort, in addition to sort of creating the model for this industry, he was also one of the early champions of creating like bipartisan teams that would work for these often unsavory foreign interests because he understood that like
Right.
it wasn't enough. I mean, in the Ukraine example with Viktor Yanukovych is a good one, and that's the one that he recruited Tony Podesta to work on with him. But he also recruited, and at the time, Tony Podesta, you're right, his brother John Podesta is in the Obama administration. This is 2010 through 2012. But he also recruited Vin Weber, who is a former Republican congressman who was working with the Romney campaign then and was regarded as a potential Secretary of State if Romney beat Obama in 2012. So Manafort recognizes like it's not enough for me to just win over the Obama administration, which is currently in power. I have to have an eye towards what happens if Republicans retake power. So he recruits Vin Weber to this team, and all of the people who he recruited for this team end up coming in under scrutiny from the Justice Department for having violated FARA. Tony Podesta and Vin Weber are investigated. They suffer severe reputational consequences. Vin Weber leaves his firm. Tony Podesta's firm actually collapses under the sort of scrutiny of the Justice Department. There's another guy, Gregory Craig, who was the White House counsel during the first Obama term, who Manafort also recruited. He is actually indicted for not violating FARA, but for lying to the Justice Department in the midst of the investigation over whether he violated FARA. He's acquitted by a jury, which I think is telling because it shows that this law, the Foreign Agents Registration Act, created in the late 1930s, is maybe not up to snuff when it comes to the modern
Right.
ways that influence is exerted in the foreign space in Washington. But it just goes to show you the way that the pendulum had swung when Manafort and all these other people were doing this type of activity and not registering. Farah was sort of an afterthought, and the Justice Department didn't put a lot of resources into trying to enforce it. And then suddenly there's a ton of resources, a ton of attention being put on it, and all these people, the Podestas, Vin Weber's firm, they're all retroactively trying to bring themselves into compliance and FARA filing for work that they had done in many cases years ago in order to try to avoid the wrath of the Justice Department and these prosecutors. Some did it successfully, others, like Manafort, went to jail. But I think there was a period of time when there were a lot of people in this industry who were quite scared that
Right.
the Wild West, the days of the Wild West had ended, and the bill was going to come due in a way that could redound to their detriment.
Here we are with Robert Strick, a man who dropped out of college, who dropped out of high school, who never wrote a good check that you could count on the first time, who's walked away from all of the leases that he has, as far as I can see, who basically tells a story. And if you believe it, he's happy. If you don't, he'll tell you another story. But he's actually in an armored Toyota driven by a security guard he's hired named Douglas. And he's traveling into the capital of Somalia called Mogadishu to the offices of a man named Fromage. That's a nom de guerre. He's an American citizen who is from Somalia, and he's been put in place as the president of Somalia, a war-torn land. The city of Mogadishu has been under permanent siege by jihadists for many years, and the State Department wants to know where its money's going. So the Fromage, the president, the American citizen president who can pull the ripcord anytime and go back to America, I believe he was in Buffalo last time we checked on him, before being the president of Somalia, wants to make good relations with the White House so that the money will keep flowing. And in this armored vehicle is Robert Strike. In the vehicle following is a young woman named Fontaine-Rose, who is his guide because she's a professional foreign policy expert, has served on the National Security Council, is now at the Atlantic Council. What is the mission for our hero at this moment, Ken?
Yeah, I think you set it up pretty well there, John. The Somalis are nervous that the spigot of U.S. foreign aid and U.S. military aid is going to be shut off under the Trump administration. Of course, Trump came in with this America First agenda, suggesting, he's outright stating that he was going to scale back foreign aid because
This is first term, still first
Yes,
term.
correct. The first term. This is actually still 2018. I think it's late 2018, and so the government of Somalia is quite nervous about this, and it's pivotal to their continued existence and ability to fight off these terrorists, these Islamic terrorists who are threatening the government of Somalia. They need U.S. support and assistance and military assistance and training. And so the possibility that they might lose that spurs them to look for someone who could help them improve their relations with Washington under Trump. And they turn to Robert Strick and they sign his firm, Sonoran Policy Group, to a contract that's worth $100,000 a month to do that. That's a pretty good contract. And so Strick prides himself on not being one of these lobbyists who just sits around in an expensive Italian suit at Cafe Milano, one of the CNBC restaurants in Georgetown that a lot of lobbyists and public officials go to. Although it should be noted that Strick does spend a lot of money there. But he also wears a cowboy hat and likes to see himself as an outsider. And so he is wearing this cowboy hat as he rides in this armored Toyota being driven by security guards who he has retained to help him get into the president's palace in Mogadishu. And as they pull up to a checkpoint outside the palace, there is some gunfire, and Strick is quite panic stricken. He actually calls his wife from the back seat, thinking that this is maybe the end of him. The people who are with him assure him, "No, this is sort of the way it goes, in Mogadishu." And Kirsten Fontenrose, the woman who you mentioned, who is a sort of sophisticated, experienced player in this space, ends up telling me later, yeah, I don't remember it being quite as dire as Robert Strick recounted it, but she does affirm that like there was gunfire here at this checkpoint. They ultimately get in to the president's palace. They get through the checkpoint without harm. They get into the president's palace and they talk to him. And Strick is his charming self, and makes a bunch of promises about what they can do to help Somalia during the Trump administration. They keep getting paid for a while. Ultimately, the president of Somalia decides that they're not getting what they want, even though they do get some things. I should say, like when we talk about questions about Strick's effectiveness, they do end up keep it. There was one point at which the Trump administration shut off the flow of money because of the concerns that this money was actually just going to the terrorists. It's I'm forgetting the name of the Boko Haram is the name of the sorry, Al
No,
Shabaab.
this
Al
is Al
Shabaab.
Shabaab, the Al
Right, you
Qaeda
got it.
outfit, Al
Right.
Shabaab.
Right. The Trump administration shut off the flow of money. They end up turning it back on. Strict claims
Right.
credit for that. It's unclear with a lot of these things, I should say. It's unclear as to like the cause and effect and whether the lobbying was the definitive thing or not. But clearly the Somalis thought that they were getting something from Strick before, and they got this money restored, this flow of money restored before they ended up moving on to a
A-
different lobbyist.
And the same scene without the gunfire happens in Caracas when Strick goes to meet Maduro, the dictator and illegitimate president of Venezuela. Strick has a style here. He goes where there is considered to be a lack of virtue. I'm being diplomatic here. At the bottom of the list of nations for fair play and transparency and nonviolence. And that is where the pickings can be good. And
Yeah.
Strick makes the case that he's a private diplomat. It's not a bad case. I don't believe it, but it is a case he makes, Ken. We've got a minute.
Yeah, that's right. And I think this does harken back to sort of the highest and best examples of like where this industry and where this type of representation can be useful and can serve a purpose that is in the public interest. Manafort, for example, did serve as a back channel between the Reagan and Bush administrations, and particularly the CIA during those administrations, and a number of foreign leaders who were seen as bulwarks against communism. Strick is trying to recreate that for the Trump era. And in the Trump era, it's a lot more about personality and appealing to Trump personally than it is about stopping communism. So one of the places where where Strick pitches his services is in Venezuela. He does get a
All right.
one-on-one meeting with
Oh,
Maduro.
if you go to Washington in foreign policy and you don't come out rich, what's wrong with you? It's the question that gets asked again and again as I read this book. We now go to the Biden administration, elected in 2020. Yes, there are problems for the Trump administration, January 6th, and Rudy Giuliani and claims of fraud that were fraudulent claims. But we're going to concentrate on how the Democrats do foreign interests and lobbying and connections. They don't hide it as in any fashion. They actually give it titles. The people who move back and forth, the New York Times has used the metaphor for years. It's very evocative. Revolving door. You can be a director of intelligence here, and you can be a member of a lobbying firm there. It's more evident when you do it, putting your hand out asking for cash. I don't believe that's the way the Biden administration team does it, but they come in and out. We mentioned the Podestas. The one I'm concentrating on, Ken, is Anita Dunn, who I believe was a prominent player in the Obama administration, first and second, and now reemerges into the Biden administration. And she's connected to a very large, successful, and prominent firm. Do I say that correctly?
Yeah, I mean, she is a founding member and one of the name members of this firm, although they use the initials, so they don't use her name, but it's called SKDK, and she is the D. Anita Dunn is. And this firm helped, I mean, it's not dissimilar from the Manafort model that we talked about earlier. This firm and Anita Dunn helped run the Biden campaign. They also helped, run the Obama campaign, but for our purposes, she was a key player in the Biden campaign and through her firm. And when Biden won, her firm suddenly was in high demand, as you might imagine, from corporate domestic players, corporate foreign players, and foreign governments, and they did quite well, and they represented a number of them. And Anita Dunn went into the White House and did not disclose, interestingly, much about her work in the private sector because this firm, SKDK, did not register under FARA and seldom they registered some stuff, I should say. But they largely said that the work that they were doing was not lobbying. In fact, it was just providing advice, strategic advice on how to navigate Washington and how to navigate governments around the world. And that was quite lucrative for her. And she wasn't alone. There were a number of other firms that were
West Exec, I believe, is another one to mention.
yeah, that's a good one because this was a firm that I think is illustrative of this revolving door. It was started by a number of prominent Democratic officials right after Trump won. So this is at the end of the at the end of the Obama administration. A number of these people had worked in the Obama administration, and when Trump upset Hillary Clinton, a lot of these people who had been probably well positioned to become officials in the Clinton administration that wasn't, instead ended up starting a firm on the outside called West Exec, which is named for the road that goes between the West Executive Office Building, which is a sort of White House spillover annex, and the White House. And that was intentional. That was to signal, hey, these are people who have access in both of these places, the West Exec Office Building and also the White House, and understand how things work. And so the founders of it were none other than Tony Blinken, who played a prominent role in the Obama administration. Of course, would go on to become Biden's Secretary of State, as well as Michelle Flournoy, who was rumored to be the possible defense secretary under, well, probably under Hillary Clinton's administration, but certainly under
Oh, let me
Hunter
read some of
Biden.
the list, Ken. You've done a
Yeah.
wonderful job for us here. Avril Haines, Director of National Intel, becomes DNI. Chris Inglis becomes National Cyber Director. Barbara Leaf becomes Assistant Secretary of State for Near Eastern Affairs. Lisa Monaco becomes Deputy Attorney General. Matt Olson becomes Assistant Attorney General for the National Security Division. Eli Ratner becomes Assistant Secretary for Defense for Indo-Pacific Security Affairs. Daniel Shapiro. I could go on. Good heavens, Ken. The Republicans pretend that they're doing influence peddling. The Democratic model is you got to go to work at the White House and then it's okay. it's
Yeah, and the argument here, John, is like this is the permanent professional class of Washington, and
right,
like what
right.
would you have these people do after, when they're no longer in power? Should they just like retire, or can they find ways to like use their expertise that are financially beneficial and rewarding for them that sort of serve they would say serve this purpose of like creating a back channel or helping to advise these clients on how to navigate the US government. But like clearly there is an influence peddling element here. If you look at some of the clientele, they include everyone. I'm talking about West Exec advisors now. They include everyone from Boeing, the major defense contractor, to Israeli artificial intelligence and facial recognition companies, to the Japanese conglomerate SoftBank, the Royal Bank of Canada, the British Australian mining conglomerate Rio Tinto. So, like, these are clients that want to know how to navigate Washington and see great value in paying someone or paying a firm that is staffed by people who have experience inside of the administration. And even if they're not registering under FARA or formally lobbying, they are doing something akin to that. And this is the way that the influence industry at large, and particularly the foreign influence industry, works. It's valuable. It's more valuable to have people who have ties to people inside or an understanding of how things work inside than it is to pay people who are political science professors or have a sort of more academic understanding of the way that Washington works. And there's many a vacation home on the eastern shore of Maryland that has been paid for private school tuitions for the kids of people who go in and out of government. And when they're out of government, it's time for them to collect these big paydays at places like West Exec
Hunter Biden,
Advisors.
I want to tie the bow on this one. it comes to a pardon by the president for Hunter Biden, for his brother Jim, I believe for the whole family, because of the concern that there is a compromise here that is very deep and can be found out. That is known to the American people at the time, so I'm not worried about that. The question is, the Hunter Biden story has some loose ends that were not tied up. The Chinese influence operation, did we ever get any clarity about where the money went and how that the money stopped and that Hunter Biden no longer represents any of that?
Yeah, I mean, we do know that that Hunter Biden in particular was paid millions of dollars by these two Chinese entities that were 100%. I mean, they were 100% part of the sort of economic influence operation of the Chinese government, the Belt and Road Initiative, it was called. And there is, I think, some convincing reporting, including my book, but also by others, including this Michael Isikoff, this legendary Washington, D.C. reporter, that this, came as and appeared to parallel real influence operations that the Chinese were conducting in other parts of the world, including Africa. It's notable, John, that the guy Patrick Ho, who we talked about, who Hunter Biden referred to as the
Right.
expletive spy chief of China, like he was charged in the US for violations of the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act that stem from claims he was convicted. He wasn't just charged. Claims that he was bribing the families of African leaders on behalf of this Chinese entity to create favor and potentially start infrastructure projects in those countries. That sounds like a pretty similar fact pattern to what we saw with the Chinese payments to the Biden. So you're right to point out that the pardon absolves Hunter, or it inoculates Hunter is a better word, against charges that could stem from this. And it's not at all a coincidence that the dates that were provided in the pardon for any potential criminal activity that could have occurred between the date that they provided, it was the spring of 2014, and the present being the end of the Biden administration, that period is when Hunter Biden was starting his most aggressive pursuit of foreign paydays, including in Ukraine as well as Romania. And I think that like there was real concern, and there should have been real concern about Hunter Biden's vulnerabilities to a charge under the Foreign Agents Registration Act, which of course now cannot come because he's been pardoned preemptively for anything.
And Robert Strick, we need to mention that he throws several parties at the occasion of the victory for President Trump in 24 and the inauguration, and he talks about giving lots of money to the inauguration committee. In other words, he remains Robert Strick, the man we love, the character we can't take our eyes off of. And when he got to the part that he's pitching the Taliban, that was almost a bridge too far for me, but I've recovered myself, Ken. Do we know what happened to it, that pitch?
Yeah, that they either didn't hire anyone or went elsewhere. Of course, there's a lot of issues in play there with sanctions that make it hard to collect paydays from the most sort of unsavory of foreign interests because the US government ends up limiting their ability to access the US financial system. That said, this became in the second term, this became Strick's sort of meal ticket, is representing sanctioned figures by offering to help get them off of sanctions. So among his clients now are these two Russian executives for the Russian state government-owned defense contractor Rostec, who the Rostec is supplying the Russian army in its invasion of Ukraine. These are
It is Ukraine. It's
yeah, I mean, these are people who are not, it's difficult to find a lens through which to view them that is not, does not
it's
lead to the conclusion that they're bad guys under
I
traditional
think they're
U.S. foreign
called the
policy.
enemy in the old-fashioned
Yeah,
day.
yeah. So Strick's claim there is that, like, no, they too, like, it could be useful to the U.S. if they were to have sanctions lifted on them because they could potentially, there could be goodwill there, or they could be, useful for parts of the Russian economy that are more Western facing, that might that might create goodwill with the U.S. It's a tortured argument, but it's one that Strick has continued to make as he has moved further sort of towards he's become an advocate for increasingly more devilish clients, including these Russians, and he's still at it.
All of this adds up to, is there a solution or is this the way the world is? Ken, you've watched this again and again, and the excuses given, I generalize on both sides. There was nothing wrong here. This was a political persecution. It had to do with the election, not with the facts of the matter. And the Justice Department is being weaponized. That was a Manafort argument. That was Hunter Biden argument. I imagine it could be an argument of any one of these lobbyists. How do we respond to that, Ken?
Well, I think that unfortunately it's getting harder to offer a response that is convincing to the American public, both because there's just been just a seemingly unending string of scandals that have like come out of this space being the confluence of US government and politics and foreign interests and foreign paydays. And so, Trump in particular has appears to have successfully convinced his supporters that you cannot trust law enforcement entities to prosecute without politics, to follow the facts and prosecute cases on the merits. And we saw that with his reelection. I mean, he was running in 2024 as he put it, your retribution. Like he was openly campaigning, seeking retribution against people who had prosecuted him and his supporters. And what we see is this being embraced around the world by, Viktor Orban or officials I write about just tease at the very end that Rudy Giuliani went to work for or went to meet with a dictator in the Republic of Srpska, which is a autonomous region in Bosnia and Herzegovina, a Serbian region, where the leader, the Serbian nationalist named Milorad Dodik, was being prosecuted by courts in Bosnia and was sanctioned by the U.S. government for significant corruption and for flouting the Dayton Peace Accords. Well, Rudy Giuliani goes over there to work for him, to host him on a podcast. Paul Manafort ends up going over there to work for him. Some of the same characters, and their argument now on behalf of this guy is that no, you cannot believe that the charges here by the Bosnian court or the rationale by the U.S. government for sanctioning this guy are valid. In fact, he's being persecuted because he's a right-wing populist, like Trump, because he supports Trump. And at least you think that argument is just about framing, like, political positioning. Just last month, the US government lifted the sanctions on this guy and a number of his supporters as a result of, or if not as a result of, at least at the same time as there is this sophisticated lobbying and influence campaign being launched by people who are close to Trump, making arguments that clearly resonate with him, such that it is just harder and harder, I think, to enforce these types of laws without generating skepticism from their targets and from the supporters of their targets. And I should add, John, that we're not even really trying anymore because Pam Bondi, President Trump's attorney general, herself a former foreign lobbyist, registered under FARA for the state of Qatar.
So the chief of staff for
Yes.
was
Yeah, she
so.
had Susie Wiles was a lobbyist as well. She was registered under FARA for Nigeria, although she said that she did not actually
Well, let
work
me
on it
introduce
there.
you to Nigeria. We've got a problem there again.
Right. Yeah. So, um, you
And
know,
the president is making remarks about bombing Nigeria while his chief of staff registered for Nigeria. Huh? I mean, I get confused. My head goes around.
No, it's a good point. I would just say to continue the thread on the Pam Bondi, she one of her first moves as attorney general was to announced the decriminalization of FARA. That is
Right,
that
right.
the U.S. government would not allocate significant prosecutorial resources to bringing criminal charges related to violations of FARA. And so, if anything, I think the pendulum is swinging back towards the Wild Wild West. And by the way, I should correct myself. Susie Wiles had registered for the People's Democratic Party of Nigeria, so not for the government. And I
Oh,
don't
okay.
know.
No, nice detail. That's helpful because Nigeria would be Tinubu, who is the boss, and it's many moving parts. But Ken, it's in other words, the law is now like that thing on mattresses. Remove this and it's illegal.
Right.
So,
Yes. And I think there was a period of time where it was like that, and it sort of openly acknowledged that it was
right.
like that. And then we had the pendulum swing more towards, more rigorous enforcement, and that was seen as a correction, but possibly an overcorrection by the Trump folks who are now sort of decriminalizing both, I should say, both the Foreign Agents Registration Act and the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, another law that's used to sort of regulate U.S. Political involvement abroad. And so, yeah, I think we're back to the Wild West.
We have you, Ken. Kenneth Vogel for the New York Times and for his book, Devil's Advocates, the hidden story, not so hidden right now, of Rudy Giuliani, Hunter Biden, and the Washington insiders on the payrolls of corrupt foreign interests. This is CBS Eye on the World. Thank you, Ken.
Hey, it
I'm,
was a treat. Thank
I'm
you.
John Batchelor.